Welcome everyone. This is a joint event co-sponsored by DEC and IEG, and I'm pleased to welcome my good friend Neil Phantom, whom we worked before in some other capacity, and today he's co-chairing this event with me. My name is Auguste Kwame. I'm Director for Human Development and Economic Management Evaluation in IEG. So today we'll first hear Drew, who will present to us six banks big data project. We think they're the most mature big data project. And then he will be followed by some lightning talks. Lightning talks means no more than 5 minutes, and I'm supposed to make sure that they don't speak for more than 5 minutes. We'll first hear from Ryan Engstrom, then Tatiana Kiros, and I think Holly Crumbeck, if she's connected, will also make a presentation. She's in New York today. And then we'll conclude with Nancy. Before each of the presentations, I will say a few words about the presenters, including the project they're working on and their background. But for now, we'll hear, and also I wanted to mention that we'll hear from Sonia, who is the TTL of the IEG's big data evaluation. She will say a few words on the data evaluation because we'd like all of you to know about the evaluation, and we want to advertise it so that when the report comes out, you read it and give us feedback and hopefully use it in your day-to-day work. So first, Neil, and then we'll hear a few words from Sonia, and then we'll go to Drew, and then the lightning talks.
Yeah, thanks, August. Indeed, you're right. We've worked together for some years, actually, before you came over to IEG. So I just want to congratulate you first on moving to IEG and getting the new job. It's good to see you here. August and I used to work together on macro statistics, actually, one of the things we used to correspond on. But I just wanted to say, a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to participate in the first World Data Forum in Cape Town. I don't know if people have heard of that event, but it was an interesting event. It was around about almost 2,000 people turned up at that, and it was organized with the idea of getting different data communities together to sort of talk to each other. And what they're really trying to stimulate around the world is this idea of a data revolution. And it felt a little bit like the statisticians of the world, and I would count myself as one of those, meets computer scientists of the world, meets geographers of the world, and meets journalists of the world. And I just wondered how many people in this room would categorize themselves into one of those categories. Have we got any statisticians here, apart from me? I'm a statistician, I'm going to admit to it. Olivier's going to admit to it. Anybody else? Yeah. I think if we'd titled this talk, the opportunities of big statistics, nobody would have come, I But we call it big data. Any computer scientists? Anybody in that area that would call themselves a computer scientist? Great. Any geographers in the room? I know there's at least one, because I saw them on the... Okay. Any sort of journalists or people who are communication specialists? So we've got them all. I think when you combine them together, oftentimes people call them data scientists. Anybody call themselves a data scientist in this room? Well, there are a few. But I'm sure that if we'd done that poll a few years ago here in the bank, we would have had no data scientists whatsoever. Everybody would have called themselves any economists in the room. How about that? Yeah. I bet some of you are really data scientists. Anyway, at this meeting 2 weeks ago, one of the things that stuck in my head was something from a guy called John Pullinger. He's the head of the UK Statistical Service. He's their chief statistician, and his basic job is to produce thousands and thousands of statistics for the UK, from GDP to population to all sorts of other things. But he said something interesting. He said, the job of statisticians is really not to produce statistics. That's not our job. The job of a statistician is really to help people make better decisions about their lives, whatever that means, whether that's policymaker, whether that's just somebody trying to catch the bus in the morning. And I think that sums up our interest in the bank as well, in big data, quite nicely. We're really looking, I think, for ways in which big data, or perhaps we could call it new data, can be used to help people make better decisions in whatever they do. And so what's big data? August already admitted he doesn't know what it is.
No, I don't.
Somebody once described this to me as data that you can't process on either a single computer or a single server, and I think that might have been the original definition. I'm not sure if that definition is being used today, because we have really, really big computers, right? and so it's quite possible to produce, to analyze quite a lot of stuff on a single computer these days. But I guess what we're really, and I think the other thing about big data is August, it sort of sounds a bit foreign, alien, right? It sounds a bit hard, a bit geeky.
Yeah.
And I do think we've got to sort of try and break that barrier a bit. But what I really think we're talking about is data from sources we didn't have before. Or perhaps it's the analysis of data that we couldn't do before. And I think there are a few examples. I cut my teeth as a statistician, 30 years ago on things like consumer price indices. And I used to sort of think, maybe we could get that price data from, I don't know, supermarkets or, direct from their tills. People are, or they're labeling prices all the time, right, on machine. But of course, then that data wasn't really computerized. But today, you can do things like that. You can get records from retailers. You can even get data on prices from the internet. The Billion Prices Project at MIT does exactly that, and takes that data and tries to use it in something that's useful. So I think we're really talking about new data sources, not necessarily big data sources. And I think the thing that interests us is how can we use that data to make better decisions. We know that it holds big opportunities. That's the title of this talk, and there are many examples of that. Many of the biggest companies in the world these days are really based on the analysis of big data. Google's probably the best example. This Google search box is really a big data algorithm, I would propose. But anyway, I think what we're looking for at the bank, and I think what's useful about this seminar and many others on big data, is really how we can move past a little bit the promise of big data. We hear a lot about that. We hear a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence. We hear lots of small projects that have used big data for the benefit of development. But many of them appear, at least to many of us, to be a little bit experimental. So we're really looking to learn the lessons as to how we can move past that idea of a promise. And I think I'm going to end my little introductory talk by just saying I think we need at least two things for that to move ahead. And the first thing, of course, we actually need some big data to use, or some new data sources to use. And that, it turns out, isn't always as easy as it sounds, and it'll be very interesting to hear from the speakers today as to how they've tackled that particular problem, or whether that's been a problem for them. Big data may not be public data, it may be private data, it may be held by companies. It may be produced by things which are pretty expensive. I mean, I see there's a couple of talks on satellite images. Sometimes that can be available cheaply, but oftentimes it's expensive. It still costs a lot of money to throw a satellite into the air. It can be difficult to get at. Cell phone data, there's one talk on using call detail records, I believe. Call detail records are pretty sensitive information, both from a confidentiality point of view, but also from a commercial point of view. And I guess the other thing that bothers me as a statistician is that it's almost always biased in some way. The phrase "big data, big bias" is something you hear quite a lot. And that may not matter if we can understand the bias and correct for it, or at least be aware of it. Maybe that's okay. But to understand that kind of bias, you really need people too, and that's the second thing we need. So we need data sources, but we really need people that can turn those data sources into something that can be used for the public good. And that, I think, is where, you folks come in. But it's really, I would propose, it's really where data scientists of all kinds come in. And I think we need more data scientists in the world, I suppose. And that can be a statistician, it can be a computer scientist, it can be a geographer, it can even be a journalist in some cases. But I think it's sort of trying to merge some of those skills together, which really, in my opinion, sort of makes a data scientist stand out. And it's very interesting. I do have, my team is sort of broadly split into half statisticians and half data scientists, but I can tell you if I advertise for a statistician these days, I might get a handful of applications, but if I advertise for a data scientist, I'll get hundreds of applications. And I think that's the sort of way that's moving. Anyway, in these talks, I think we've got both of those conditions satisfied from what I see. We have people who've got data sources and people who've been able to analyze them. So I'm really looking forward to it, and what we're looking forward to is seeing how we can actually get past the promise of big data and really turn that into something which can be used to help people make better decisions. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Neil. The first presenter on big data, and that would be Drew. Drew Bent is a student at MIT studying computer science, electrical engineering, and physics. He is the 2016 recipient of the MIT Outstanding New Leader Award, and he is the youngest person to have worked at Sony Ericsson and Khan Academy, and he did that while he was still in high school. Drew, you make the rest of us feel very old. So over to you. You have 12 to 15 minutes because I understand you're going to talk about 6 projects, including giving an overview of the 3 other projects we're going to hear about. So I would suggest we move very quickly on the 3 projects we're going to hear about, and say a bit more about the 3 other projects we're not going to hear about.
That's right, yeah, I've already picked some out.
Great.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. Oh, yeah, thanks. I guess I really appreciate it, and thanks both for co-hosting. And actually, one of the ways I got interested in big data applied towards sort of policy issues and working in countries was the Billing Prices Project. I went to a talk at MIT several years back and heard from the team. And one of the interesting points here at the Billing Prices Project is that they're trying to look at CPI, or Consumer Price Index, by automating it and scraping the internet for billions of prices from Amazon and different online websites, so that you don't need to manually send people to grocery stores to tally up these prices. But even in this case where they're using big data, I know because some of my friends are in this lab, and there's an army of undergraduate researchers who have to validate this data. And so it's not all about this big data. There's a ton of manual work still there. And so I think that's a very important point. I also want to thank Sonia. Really, this whole event is her brainchild, and I've been very lucky to get to work with her on the work I'm going to present on now. Great, thanks for setting this up. So my name is Drew Bent, and I'm going to be talking, as Gustav mentioned, about an overview of the 6 projects. Since we're getting the lightning talks, I'm going to focus more on the trends and some of the key challenges that these projects face. So here's 6 of the most mature projects in the World Bank that we've been studying in IEG. You can notice that, let's see if this laser works, they use a variety of big data sources, but there's a lot of overlap. A lot of them are using satellite imagery, cell phone data. And so even though the data sources are somewhat similar, the applications, there's a huge variety of applications, and it's being used across the world. So starting with the Philippines, cities are already helping minimize traffic by tracking or really looking at the flows of vehicles through the city using cell phone GPS data. In the Balkans, in Albania and Kosovo, a team is helping citizens secure property rights by using drones and safely flying them over towns to capture images and identify the property boundaries. In Uganda, a team is studying maize production and crop variety using satellite images. In Sri Lanka, as we'll hear about shortly, the team is using satellite imagery to estimate poverty in different villages, and it's extracting features from the images like building density and roof material. In Latin America, they're also using satellite imagery, but not to map poverty, but rather to identify slums in cities and other types of land cover. And then finally, once again in the Philippines, citizens in cities are now able to track road infrastructure projects through a combination of satellite imagery, crowdsourced photos, and open source maps. So a lot of projects going on, and these are just the ones that we picked because they were very mature in how they use big data. But it's important to note that they're not only using big data, as I was just talking about, there's still all sorts of traditional data that's being used side by side with the big data, often surveys and other manual methods of collecting data. And so I'll talk about how these fit together. So the real key challenge with working with big data, at least how I see it, is big data is pretty much unusable in its raw format. And this is true with all data, but it's especially true, and it's really magnified with big data, which comes in a variety of formats. And so the challenge for teams is to figure out how to take this big data in this raw format and combined with traditional data, find a way to turn it into these sort of actual insights that we heard from Neil. And that's what I'm going to be doing for 3 of these projects right now. To kind of give you a sense, this is kind of they really represent what I've seen in the bank is the different ways in which big data and traditional data come together. So starting with urban congestion in the Philippines, and we will hear more about this later, so I'll give a very sort of brief overview. What they do is they have the team has access to real-time data from taxi drivers, their locations in different cities. And so what they're able to do with that data is they can figure out the average driving speeds along different segments of the road. And that's very important data for city officials who want to monitor where congestion is occurring at different times of the day and finding ways to minimize that congestion. So in some ways, this process of going from this raw data to these traffic conditions seems like a relatively linear and straightforward process. But there's still all sorts of questions about how you interpret this data. And so one example that I heard from the team was, how do you differentiate between a parked taxi and a taxi that's simply stuck in very bad traffic? You need to know this in order to know whether to include the data or not. And so it's for reasons like this that it's incredibly important to validate these results with the traditional methods, and in this case that involves sending drivers out with stopwatches and clipboards and manually checking all of these different travel times. And so it was through this validation process that the team was able to recognize that there was a discrepancy between their new method and the traditional data, and recognize that they were not differentiating between parked taxis and taxis that are stuck in traffic in the correct way, and so they were able to correct that. So now moving over to Albania and Kosovo, looking at cadastral maps. These are the drones you've been hearing about, or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs for short. And you'll notice that you hear about drones in the news. This drone is actually quite small. It is expensive. I think this drone here costs $25,000 because it has very good cameras on it. And the way the team was using these drones was that they would fly these over these towns, a specific town, and they would take images. And then they would convert these photos into orthophotos, which are photographs where the distortions are removed so it looks like a projection, like a map. So it's just like when you go to Google Earth and you look down and there's no camera distortions. Now the way this could be done, and the way it was done otherwise in the past, was not at the local level, but at a national level. And so they would send manned airplanes above the clouds and take photos of the whole country. And so that would take many years, this process. And so they found a way to do it in a few weeks for a given town. Now, this was not the whole process. There was still many steps after traditional work. So it was followed by 2 months of field work in which they had to go door to door and show citizens orthophotos and get them to identify where where the property boundaries were. And then another 6 months or so of adjudication. And so it's important to note that the drones, were not solving everything. They were rather replacing, a key bottleneck in this process. And that bottleneck was the production of the orthophotos. And so there's still cases when you would want to take, national orthophotos, but if there's a specific town that needs an up-to-date cadaster, you may not want to have to wait 10 years to get the next, national orthophoto. And so that's kind of where they fit in. There are some challenges, though, of using drones, and that comes from, it's an unproven technology, or at least when they started, they were the first ones using drones in the bank. And so that meant that there was resistance in the bank, particularly from the legal team, who was worried about the image of the bank, owning a drone, flying it over towns and cities. And so what the team found very helpful here was to start very small. They had started the smaller prototype in Albania before they started to expand this and scale it up in Kosovo. And that, basically helped prove the methodology and that it could work, and it helped gain support within the bank. And then finally, I want to talk about how in Uganda, a team is estimating crop yields in areas where the self-reported crop yields from farmers may not be completely accurate for a variety of reasons, different biases and stuff like that. So what the team did is they started with satellite imagery, and they extracted, or they sort of analyzed it and extracted what's known as the green chlorophyll vegetation index, or GCVI. And we can think of this kind of as how much green is in the image, although that's not entirely correct. And you might imagine that there's some relationship between GCVI and what the crop yields are. But it's not immediately clear what that relationship is. And so the team had to go through a process that we call in computer science a training process. You have to train a model to essentially come up with this relationship or this calibration. And so what you really want to know is, if you see this much green in the image, that corresponds to precisely this crop yield. And so the way the team did it was they did crop cutting. So they went out and actually harvested in small areas of fields to figure out the precise, and exact ground truth crop yields, looked at the GCVI, saw that relationship, and then that's now allowing them to expand to areas where they don't have ground truth data. They can just figure out the GCVI and start to estimate the crop yield. And so what I've described here is just a very simple example, but this is the approach that's used kind of throughout the way that we do machine learning and the way that we create these models. Now it's important to note that there's a challenge here, which is the quality of the estimates are going to totally depend on the quality of the data that you're sending in, which in this case is the resolution of the satellite imagery. And so the team faced a trade-off here, because on one hand they wanted to have low-resolution satellite imagery. It's cheap, easily accessible, but at the same time they need to make sure they could have the quality of estimates that they needed. And for them, they noticed that at 2-meter resolution they could estimate very well fields with a single crop. However, fields with multiple crops, that wasn't a high enough resolution. And so finding what these trade-offs are requires testing, and so they're in the process of testing this out right now. So I just want to summarize now with a few key takeaways. I've been talking about how you can go from the raw data, which comes in a variety of formats, and turn that into actionable insights. And it involves a lot of traditional data, and that gets incorporated in different ways. We talked about a few of them. And there's other examples I can talk about more in Q&A. But the other thing is that these new data sources and big data really raises a lot of trade-offs. And these are not new trade-offs. Working with any data, you have trade-offs. But again, these are magnified with big data. And so it's very important to start to consider these trade-offs. And most of the trade-offs center around the idea that big data is you're not often measuring directly what you want to know. It's often a proxy. And you can do incredible things with these proxies, but you have to be very careful. We've mentioned biases. And so even though as a computer scientist, I think big data and these new data sources, they're often a lot cheaper, they're often more up to date, you have to weigh that against the trade-off of you may be now getting an estimate that's less accurate than you could with traditional data, because it's being collected in a less direct way. And so these are questions, they're not technical questions, but they have to really be assessed by the people who are making decisions of how much these things matter. And then finally, I'll just end with kind of a fun thing, a prediction, really as an outsider here, just as a computer scientist looking in. What I see as a challenge going forward for the development community of using the latest technologies from big data and computer science is a trend that we're seeing in computer science right now is there's these latest advances over the past 5 years in machine learning, neural networks, the things that are going to be driving or self-driving cars. And they have a lot of potential. The results are really spectacular right now, but it's coming at the cost of these things are turning into black boxes. A lot of the software, computer scientists don't understand, and that creates problems. I think if the development community wants to start to utilize these latest technologies that really have promising results, but it's going to be hard for evaluation, it's going to be hard for transparency, things that are super important to how development work is done. And so, there's still a lot of potential of all the technologies that are out there that are not being applied, I think, in places where they could in development work. But I think the next generation technologies, at least for the foreseeable future, will sort of there may be some tension here, and it will have to be resolved of how they can work together. So on that note, I'll hand it back to Augusta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Drew. So let's move to the first lightning talk with Ryan on Sri Lanka. Ryan Ekstrom is co-author with David Newhouse and John Hirsch of Poverty from Space in Sri Lanka. He's currently associate professor in the Department of Geography at George Washington University and holds a PhD in geography, currently from San Diego State and UC Santa Barbara. Ryan,
yes.
what is yours?
Thank you. And so this is a project we started working on a few years ago with funding from DEC, Strategic Programs. And so David Newhouse is the one who's primarily run this. I came in as a remote sensing person to help him out, to make this link between big data and actionable stuff. And then John Hirsch, who presented this 2 weeks ago, this is what he's been doing for his PhD, so we've all been working together for a while. So the motivation for this work was originally local estimates of poverty are expensive and rare, currently require census, typically once per decade. So what we see is, hey, we have remotely sensed data, can we start to use this to update or improve local estimates of poverty? But these local estimates are good for budget allocations, geographically targeted programs, assess poverty impacts, pockets of poverty. And so what happens also is in areas where you can't get data, can we use remote sensing? We can get remote sensing data anywhere in the world. So this is the big power of it. You can use it. It's very readily available anywhere in the world, anytime you want. But the question is, how do you start to use it? How do we start to implement? How do we bring it in? How do we make this connection? So we've been working with high spatial resolution imagery, and basically this project has all been about what can we take from imagery that we know how to do as machine learning, as computer science, and try to relate it to anything we can think of that's related to poverty, and develop the relationship between them. And so what we've been doing mostly is looking at extracting machine learning spatial features, generate characteristics of local areas from imagery, use these variables to predict poverty, see how well we can do it, what's the relationship between. So for us, we've been working in Sri Lanka using very high spatial resolution imagery. We have purchased this imagery. We got about 3,500 square kilometers, covers about 1,300 of the 13,000 GN divisions. And we wanted circa 2011. This is the big thing. You got to match your data sets between everything going on here. And the GN division, it's about 10,000 persons, about 2.15 kilometers squared. It's a little black lines here, so very small, okay, in terms of census data and census poverty information. And then we have the high resolution imagery. So what we did, we hired companies, Orbital Insight, Land Info, and then also some of the work I've been doing as a professor. Objects, feature identification, so Orbital Insight was going after a number of buildings, cars, shadow pixels. Land Info, roads width, fraction paved, agricultural land, roof type. This is things you see in the literature have been related to poverty based on census information. And then I work on this thing called textural and spectral features. We look at vegetation index, settlement density, histogram-oriented gradients, local binary patterns, line support regions, Gabor filter, Fourier transforms, surf, all these different things we can extract that kind of characterize urban development or lack of urban development within it. And so what I wanted to show is, so from Orbital Insight, we try to map every single building within all the imagery within it. And so this is machine learning. It's a deep learning convolutional neural network. Nobody really knows how they work. They seem to work. You need a lot of training data to do it. Okay, it seems to have pretty good accuracy. This is, we go after road width, And in the imagery, you can see it. In this case, it's land info. They're using what's called e-cognition to go after it, and this is where they go in and use objects and go after objects. They actually did a lot of hand training to do this because it's very hard to extract. Within it, they also went after roof type, and so they labeled the different roof types within an area. Also, and then I do local binary pattern moments. This is one of the examples of the spatial features. And what this does is it looks at an image, it looks at the variability in image. This is one from the internet that you can see. You run local binary pattern moments, you have dark areas, you have bright areas. What you find is this starts to characterize urban settlements without having to go into classification. Because sometimes it's really difficult. What's a building, what's a parking lot, and identifying these things. This can kind of give you some information about it. So what we did is we developed a relationship from the census variables. We get 10% poverty rate from the census, from all those GN divisions, the 1,300 GN divisions. The 10% poverty rate. We developed regression relationships between all these, and you see building density variables, about 33% of the variation. Overall, we're explaining about 60%. 33% of that is from building density, 27% from roof types, the texture about 14%, and different variables over this. We have both urban and rural within this, trying to estimate poverty. So in conclusion, we get about 60 to 65% of the variation of poverty just from high-resolution imagery. We've tried random forest support vector machines. We get even better results if we use those. When we target performance, slightly worse than a poverty map, if we compare it to what a poverty map would estimate that we'd use in normal, far superior than nighttime lights. So if we have the high-resolution imagery, it gives you a lot better results in nighttime lights. Building type, building density, roof type, strongest predictors, vegetation index are important. This gives us a lack of building density, so that urban-rural divide. It kind of struggles in rural areas, but it gives you something. Roads and texture variables add significant explanatory value. It's hard to extrapolate out a sample. Okay, we're not that good, but we can maintain rank within it. So the big challenges to this is it takes a lot of people with different expertise to work together and understand each other. You talk to a computer scientist, they talk one language. You talk to a remote sensor, they talk another. You talk to an economist, they talk another. You really have to sit in the room and actually talk to each other and be able to understand what's going on. That is, I think, the hardest thing. Is I don't understand the poverty estimates, how you get that, but I kind of understand it. I understand the pixels. The machine learning people understand this. How do you start to put this together so we all talk on the same page? Right now, the cost of imagery is pretty high. We've been running some of this stuff on Google Earth that's actually free. I don't know if it's technically legal, but we've been doing it. Private firms, they'll tell you they can do anything. And so make sure if you're hiring a private firm, they actually know what they're doing. And make sure when you write a contract with them, they have like accuracy and how well they're going to do it, because they can give you anything. And they can be expensive. So that's why I was originally hired, just kind of give him an idea about this. And it takes a lot of programming know-how to bring all this data together. These are big data sets to be able to do this. So machine learning, probably specialized tools. Open source tools are still nascent. There's a few out there, but they're not very good. We've been using MapPy, and I think you'll hear a little bit about that in the next talk. Household survey with detailed geocodes and a shapefile. To do this, you need really good, really accurate geospatial data, and it needs to all match up, which is not easy to do. And it's not typically publicly available, and there's some sensitivity to it. So value-added satellite data can be a valuable component to household surveys. It may be a viable substitute for census indicators for estimates of local poverty, and I think some people talk about poverty next. Can potentially save money on costs, generate estimates in areas cannot be covered, and it may be able to nowcast for it, especially in areas where you don't have or have limited census data. And so one of the big things that we have is it better? Is it better than old data? And this is what we're testing right now. We have the 2000 census for Sri Lanka. Is it better to use the remote sensing? Cons and different methods. Like I said, we just created everything that we thought of from remote sensing, GIS, from these companies that we can put in there. We're just figuring out which variables are important, which ones aren't. How much is it worth? Is it worth this amount of money to put into it? This is what we're evaluating to do. Do these models travel? Does it just work for Sri Lanka, or can you move it somewhere else? And World Bank has a lot of the data, okay? And they have the ability to experiment between countries, so this is a place to kind of do it, because you need the money and you need the time. Okay, thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Then we from Sri Lanka, we move to the Philippines, where we will hear from Holly Krumbeck by video. Holly is a senior transport economist here at the World Bank, and she's focused on urban and rural transport issues in the East Asia and Pacific region. She holds a Master's of Science in Transportation and a Master's of Science in City Planning as well from MIT. After Holly, we'll hear from Tatiana, who is here in the room. Tatiana is an economist in the Transport and ICT department. She holds a Master's degree in Transport Engineering from MIT. I don't look like it's surrounded by MIT guys. And a BA in Applied Science and Mathematics and in Urban Planning from Harvard, just to change, from MIT, from Harvard University. And prior to joining the bank, Tatiana worked in the MIT labs, the MIT Transit Lab. So first, Holly from New York.
Yeah, this is going to be a recording.
Oh, it's a recording, sorry, okay, sorry.
And
My
then
bad.
we'll hear the updates.
Okay, my bad, sorry. Okay.
Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, yes. Hello. Okay. The challenge is congestion. Our counterparts struggle to address congestion because the modern day toolbox for collecting the data we need to optimize traffic signals and develop solutions looks like this. It's a capital-intensive, fixed sensor-based network. These systems are very expensive to build, expensive to operate, and require substantial technical expertise to run. And so it's really no wonder that in most places where we work, these systems tend to be pretty much non-functional. So what can we do? Well, we know that 1/3 of the global population is expected to have a smartphone soon. And these smartphones can passively or indirectly or directly collect the data that we need. And unlike those fixed sensor-based networks, the governments don't have to pay for these equipment at all. They don't have to be maintained, they don't have to be monitored. It's almost magical. But that's not new. What is new is the rise in taxi hailing apps. These are multinational companies that can have one database with hundreds of thousands of smartphone data crisscrossing urban areas, multiple cities, and even countries. Now, hold up. Wait a minute. What does that mean? That means, technically, you can take one web-based open source application and one partnership with one of these big taxi hailing apps, and you can provide congestion management services to hundreds of cities at once. It's an economy of scale that really hadn't been something we could consider before. So with the Innovation Grant, we partnered with Grab Taxi. They're a regional competitor to Uber in Southeast Asia. They have more than 150,000 drivers. They operate in 6 countries, and they're presently providing us with all of their data updated every 6 seconds. So we take their raw GPS data, and we take OpenStreetMaps, and ta-da! We developed an open source piece of software that we call Open Traffic. Open Traffic is designed for resource-constrained traffic management agencies to do network and route-based queries on traffic speed. If they try to do something to improve congestion, they can use this to see did it work. And we've also used it for other kinds of analyses. For example, with congestion, the goal isn't to get rid of it. The goal is to limit its duration. So we looked at how long is the peak hour in different cities in Southeast Asia. This was an amazing analysis because we learned there is no peak in Southeast Asian cities. It's like all peak. We also look at travel time reliability. If someone in Manila leaves for the office at 7, what's the likelihood they're going to get to the office at the same time each day? This is a critical aspect of congestion that we couldn't even touch because there's no way to quantify the problem, but now we can. We also look at corridor vulnerability. If there's a flood or an accident, is there sufficient network connectivity that people can go somewhere else? And I can tell you in Manila, no. And then we also use the platform for travel time surveys. We compared travel time survey results from a BRT project we're investing in Cebu, which took more than a month to complete, to results from the platform, and statistically the results were better and they took about a second to generate. Outside of the platform, we're using the GPS data to see if it's sufficient to optimize traffic signals. In most of the cities where we work, the detector loops and sensors that are supposed to keep the signal times, so that's a project. So the lesson learned is that the next generation of solutions for congestion management, they're going to leapfrog these capital-intensive networks. And as World Bank staff, if we're going to be helpful to advise them, we have to improve our own modern toolbox. Thank you.
Great. Great. So they've given her a big number already. So now Tatiana.
Yeah, so do you have the slides? Or?
No, if you could.
Oh, sorry.
That's
Do you have a key?
USB.
Yeah. Sorry, that's Holly had sent them to you.
So with Uber now going out of business, how are we going to do this?
Monty's left there.
The good thing is when you look at the global scale, Uber's still not the biggest TNC.
Yes, it was not. But in the US, it's going to be a smaller project. We heard for the past 2 days. Something's happening to that. So, yeah, we'll see. You need more
Any
time?
questions so
yeah,
far?
if you need more time, we can entertain. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about ground verification for any of these machine learning imagery analysis.
Ground verification. Ground verification.
In terms of,
What's going on?
in terms of what?
You seem to make very strong assumptions about the machine learning and training data sets, and I'm not sure if you have 2 or 3% of these analyzed locally, or if you just happen to have access to government archives that you can trust, or you train in another country and bring it to the
So a lot of the machine learning algorithms that we, because it was cheaper, they took and they just kind of adapted them from ones they'd already developed. And then what we did is we looked at in certain areas, if we had OpenStreetMap data and they had buildings, we started looking at what was their building count per unit area, and we started evaluating that. And it seems reasonable. It's not perfect, but they're a pretty good estimate. In terms of gross variability within the 1300, it gets the range pretty well. But there are definitely errors in this, and so that's one of the biggest issues with all this is the error and how much error can you take in it. But there's also error in the poverty estimate. So where all these errors start to come out, and this is one of the big things we're evaluating right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll have lots of time
we'll have time
for
for Q&A. Let's hear from Tatiana.
Great, thanks. So the idea is, Holly, I guess we'll use most of our 5 minutes. So I just wanted to kind of update you guys on what we've been doing with open traffic, kind of where it's going. And the interesting thing is it's grown a lot bigger than just the Philippines. So we kind of used open traffic as a way to leverage what is the Open Transport Partnership. So this is essentially an NGO that we've kind of been incubating inside the World Bank, use the leverage, the convening power of the World Bank to kind of incubate it here, but really the idea is that this will be a kind of a standalone product that actually is going to be a partnership between TNCs, between actually all the developers, and between the governments. So Open Traffic is kind of the main product that we kind of built on this. But the idea is that similarly we could have different products that kind of leverage the power of big data. So I mean, one of the main questions that was asked was, well, where do we get the data from? So we really want to create a stable stable platform for that. So the Open Transport Partnership, essentially the Open Traffic, what we've been doing is kind of creating a pool of data sources. So the Open Transport Partnership was actually signed in Transforming Transportation 2 weeks ago, and we now actually have a number of partners. So we have Easy Taxi, Grab Taxi. We're actually in conversations with a number of other different companies, so sort of Le Taxi. I think there's also one, it's not Grab, but essentially what we're trying to create is a bigger coalition of TNC, so we actually have global representation. The good thing about that is that essentially everybody's putting data into a same pool, and then you actually have a larger representation, less bias, and your data is anonymized. We have Mapsen actually as a partner that is actually helping us develop and scale up the platform, and we'll have government partners that will be able to use the platform. So essentially, what we're trying to do is build in the sustainability, and also, so this will be kind of you pay to be a part of the Open Traffic Partnership. So we're actually also looking at kind of the business plan to make it financially sustainable, which is one of the main problems with a lot of these partnerships. So kind of how are we using Open Traffic, and kind of why do we like it so much? Besides the whole understanding the city, I think that it's becoming a main way of how we look at cities and kind of how agile we can be to understand how things work. So for example, the Cebu City traffic signal timing. So in transport, how we actually code signals is a huge problem. And the delay you get on the data is it's a lot, right? You put your signals, and really this is as simple as when you have green and red. But they can actually cause huge congestions in the city. So instead of actually having to roll out an entire plan and wait a couple months to actually see the results, we can actually start seeing all of this in real time. So we've been using it to look at traffic signals, to look at congestion management, to actually look at road safety, and also how you can optimize response times for crashes and emergency response. So these are just a couple of the things that have been going on in the Philippines specifically, but other than that, we're also now looking, now that we have these global partnerships on data, to see how we can implement it in Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Bogota. So I mean, the idea is that it'll become kind of this sustainable partnership where we can actually all benefit from these kinds of data and the kind of outputs and analytics. So kind of an update on where we are.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Then we move to our last lightning talk with Nancy. Nancy Gracia is Senior Economist in the Urban, Rural, and Social Development Global Practice. She covers regional economic development primarily in LAC. She holds a PhD in agricultural and consumer economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start with the problem that motivated this work. So about 3 years ago, this is a problem that we've been facing for much longer, but when we go to the cities that we work on and we ask for the plans of the city or the GIS office, this is what we get. And when we try to start thinking about a survey and how to plan the distribution of transport infrastructure, this is what we get. This is a secondary city in Peru. We go to the Middle East, try to do a survey, ask for the census information. This is the kind of maps that you get. So really, if we are going to plan our cities better, we need better information. So how do we go about it? Well, we turn to satellite imagery for that, to really try to understand the spatial layout of cities and try to give our clients an alternative to the maps that you just saw. So we went to the literature and we said, well, Ryan was telling us about all the tools that are out there that can be used for processing satellite imagery, and that's the way we decided to go. A semi-automated algorithm that takes out or extracts the features of the imagery and produces in the end a classified layer that basically tells us what are the different classes of land covers in the city that we're analyzing it. This is not object-oriented, so it's different from what Ryan was referring to in counting cars. This is neighborhood classification. We worked with researchers, so let me backtrack a little. What was the challenge that we faced when we looked at what was available out there? Well, proprietary algorithms, as Ryan was also mentioning. So, and the second challenge, I would say, very little internal capacity for repeating this kind of analysis. Not because we didn't have the people, but because we didn't have people trained in doing this algorithm. So we set out to solve this problem in two ways. We worked with researchers that had actually helped develop these proprietary algorithms and turned them into the MyPy code, open source Python code that Ryan was referring to. And we held workshops in here that helped train some of our staff into this algorithm, so that today this kind of things can be done in-house. We have Katie here. She's one of the people that do it, or really pushes forward this kind of work in the bank. How does it work? We start with a training site. So let's say our focus is to identify commercial, industrial, residential areas in a city. So we identify these training sites. We were also interested, because we are urban practice, in identifying slums. But slums, it's impossible to identify. We cannot look at the image and know whether somebody has the title or not. So really looking at irregular areas is really meant to be a proxy of a slum on the ground. This is what we got out after the processing of the image. So this is where we start the training sites. The algorithm runs through the image. This is what we get. A classified layer that tells us where the built-up areas in the city are and which areas are more likely to be commercial, industrial, residential, or in red, irregular, or slums. This is to show you one of the largest slums in Nairobi, in Kenya. This is the map that the authorities had done going on the ground after a very long time and costly efforts. This is what the classification comes out with. So nice overlapping with what authorities have done on the ground. This goes back to the question about ground truthing. What is it that this allowed us to do beyond providing authorities with a sense of how is it that their cities are growing, what is it that's happening on the ground? We're able to compare different characteristics of the cities. What you see here is the density of roads as you move out from the city center. So what you would expect to see in a city that has, well, like a good amount of roads and infrastructure. You see roads throughout even as you move away from the city center. In our African cities, we really see that, for example, very close from the city center, the roads disappear. You have very little roads. Then we decided to take this also to another region. We started in Africa, let's take it to Central America, see if this is applicable. Take it also from bigger cities into secondary cities, see if this works. And an additional step referring to the cost that we were discussing also in other presentations. Can we take it from very high resolution The previous images that we used in Africa were 50 centimeters to coarser resolution, so 1.5 meters, that are also cheaper images. The algorithm performed well, and we classified, I forgot the number, 9 secondary cities in Central America. What did this allow? Would this also allow us to benchmark the road networks across different cities, not only in Central America, but with cities of comparable sizes in Africa, which ones are performing better or not. It also, this classification also allowed us to do better sampling for household surveys. We carried out a household survey in Dar es Salaam where we had done this classification. Well, we wanted to understand how slums differ from the rest of the city in living standards. How do you do that if you don't know where the slums are? How do you do that if you don't have a formal definition of slums? Well, the classification of the imagery provides, let's say, an identification of the slums that can then be used for stratification of the survey as one of the key stratas to be surveyed. Well, we have taken this a step farther to the field, and now have trained local officials on the use of this algorithm. We went to Argentina and spent 3 days with local authorities, training them on how to use this for their own needs. The training was enhanced, so enhanced, is that the right word? Hands-on, thank you. Sounded weird. Was hands-on, working on their data. So at the end of the workshop, the city of Córdoba was classified, and they could see how this worked. Since then, they have classified 2 additional cities. What are they using this for? Well, they wanted to know where the slums were growing. So the squares in blue here show you the areas that have been classified as slums using this algorithm. And the different colors still give you the built-up areas and how built-up has grown through time in the city. So what they were interested in finding is that the algorithm was finding not only the slums in the oldest part of the city, but also in newer parts of the city in the outskirts, things that they were not thinking about before. It also allowed them to compare their current map of the city, which is the lines in black, and this is how they're planning their city. This is the urban area that they consider for basic service provision when they think about providing transport infrastructure. Well, their city has grown well beyond that. This is the yellow part. These are areas that are classified as rural, but that they should be thinking about providing service in these areas. They were not thinking about that before. This is something similar where here the red areas are identifying zones with the highest concentration of roads, and the slum areas which appear in gray are really appearing as areas with really low concentration of roads. So something that made them think also about the provision of infrastructure, of road infrastructure in slums, how to start asking questions about that. And finally, they want to use it also as a way of updating or their census information. Here, the purple areas are areas classified as shanty with the image classification, and the highlighted areas in turquoise are areas that are vulnerable using census information. So there's not a full overlap, and what they want to understand is really what is it that the imagery is speaking that was not captured in the census. Is there something that the census information is not capturing that's important also to think about? For example, in areas like here, Why is it that this is appearing as a slum? Is it really a vulnerable area that is not being picked up by census information? And how to start thinking about that.
Thank you very much, Nancy.